anyone who is familiar with economic thinking right now probably knows that Nouriel has, I think, earned the sensationalist journalistic nickname that he hates of Dr. Doom. But I hope he won't mind my repeating it, because I think it's a name he should wear with pride. He's one of the very few economists who was actually right about the crisis, who called it in advance and saw it coming. While you are waiting for October and the release of Jim's book, A Global Life, you can keep yourself busy by reading Nouriel's bestseller, Crisis Economics, which talks about the thinking that led up to his prediction of the crisis. The last time I heard Nouriel speak, he was still pretty gloomy. So we'll hear now what he has to say. And just as a final sort of tantalizing observation about him before we hear his remarks that may lead us to feel kind of grim, I wanted to reveal to you another embarrassing fact about Nouriel, which is I first heard of him when I was an undergraduate in college because he was the economics tutor of one of my college roommates. And I'm afraid she had a huge crush on him due to his charismatic way of talking about the world economy. So there you go. She anticipated one of the great stars of economic thinking today. Please, Nouriel.
Krista, thanks very much for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure being here in front of this great audience. And speaking after Jim Wolfensohn was really truly a Renaissance man, someone who has succeeded brilliantly in business, in policy, in culture, in the arts, philanthropy, and so on. So it's an honor being here with you. I would like to speak about the outlook for the US and the global economy. I'll say only a few things about the short run, where we have many difficulties, because after all, this is a conference about the long-term opportunities, about the risk and the challenges. But we have to link what's happening in the short run with the long run. On the short term, I would say the following thing. It's been recognized we've just gotten out of the worst economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression. Luckily, we are out of it. There is a tentative US and global economic recovery, but we are not yet out of the woods. You know, in a typical economic recovery from a recession, the recovery is V-shaped. You rapidly return to potential growth, or actually above potential growth, 4 or 5% for a couple of years. I've been arguing for a while that the recovery is not going to be V-shaped. It's going to be at best U-shaped, anemic, subpar, below trend in US, in Europe, in Japan, for reasons I'll explain. And there are even risk of a double-dip recession, something like a W, if not an L. And if you look at the latest economic data, it's clear that, you know, the kind of V recovery is out of the window. The recovery has been anemic in advanced economies. We are in this hard slog of a weak economic recovery, and there are even some downside risk of a double-dip recession. Why that's the case and why it's not been a typical recovery? This crisis was caused, first of all, by excessive debt and leverage in the private sector, households, financial institutions, even some fat tail of some parts of the corporate sector. And while there's a lot of talk about the deleveraging has barely started. Those debt ratios in the private sector are stabilizing at a very high level, but there is the burden of insolvent financial institutions, households, even firms. And there's, in the meanwhile, been a massive releveraging of the public sector, very large budget deficits, 10% of GDP in most advanced economies, public debt expected by the IMF to go all the way to 120% of GDP in a number of years. Why this releveraging of the public sector was automatic stabilizers, were countercyclical fiscal policy to try to stimulate the economy after a recession, and also socialization of private losses. We put on the balance sheet of governments the losses of banks, financial institutions, households, even some corporates, and therefore we've seen now a massive releveraging of the public sector. Therefore, the recovery is going to be anemic because you need a hard slog of slow and gradual deleveraging of financial institutions, of households, and now of governments. And if governments are going to do that, the deleveraging of their own large deficits and debt, there is a risk even of sovereign defaults. Look what's happening today in Europe and in countries like Greece. So that's where there is a risk of a slow anemic recovery. In the United States, growth now is at stall speed. In the third, fourth quarter, expected to be only 1%. is not going to be a double-dip recession yet, but 1% is well below potential growth rate of 3%, and anything can tip you then into a double dip because you reach a stall speed for the economy when you're growing so much lower than potential. And it's going to feel like a recession, even if technically it's not a recession, because we growth so low, the unemployment rate is high and rising, budget deficits are larger, home prices keep on falling, losses that banks have on their mortgages, consumer credit, C&I loans are larger, and protectionist pressure are going to be worse than before. So those are the kind of risks we're facing in the US, but also in half of the Eurozone where there is still economic contraction, in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Greece, in Italy, and in a country like Japan that is in a path of slow and anemic economic growth. So those are the downside risks about the short run. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, and let me speak about what are the opportunities and potential upsides in the global economy and some of the risks we're facing. If you had to talk about the bright spots about the global economy over the short term and the medium term, I would speak about three of them. First of all, there is still a process of globalization, of trade, financial flows, migration, and you name it. And in spite of this very severe financial crisis, globalization has not reversed. Some people fear the reversal of globalization. So far, that has not occurred. Secondly, there is, as pointed out by Jim, not just in Asia, but in most of the emerging market economy, the recovery has been more V-shaped, much more robust economic growth, above potential in some cases. Why? These countries have higher potential growth than advanced economies, and they're less leveraged, both in the private sector and in the public sector. Third observation that is good about the global economy is there is still a huge amount of technological progress and innovation. In the long run, actually, as we know, technological progress and innovation is a major source of economic performance around the world. Now, if I had to talk about these three positive spots, I would like to point out what are the positive upside about them, but also some of the risks and the challenges that come from globalization, from technological progress, and from the emergence of these emerging market economies. First of all, if we had to define our era, is an era of increased globalization, greater trade in goods, but also greater trade in services. Services used not to be tradable, but now with the IT technologies, you can outsource stuff and then you do trade even in services. We have massive amount of capital flows, both foreign direct investment and foreign investment in stock, bonds, securities, and you name it. There is greater amount of labor migration and also offshore outsourcing that increases over time productivity growth. We have now global corporation firms and businesses, and we have a global supply chain that also increases productivity. And the most important thing is that there is a greater amount of technological innovation and spread of information, of innovation and ideas, of technological progress from advanced economies to emerging markets. And a lot of the innovation now is occurring also in some of these emerging market economies. And I would say the role of technological progress and innovation is key because in the long run, what really leads to economic growth, leaving aside natural population growth and demographic, is productivity growth. And productivity growth depends critically on technological progress. So we don't know what are going to be the new successful, say, sectors of the new economy in the future. We don't know whether it's going to be alternative energy and the green economy, whether lots of the progress is occurring in life sciences, things like cell research, neuroscience, genetic therapy and their applications, whether it's going to be nanotechnology and its own applications, whether it's going to be the integration of telecom and media, or new IT technology, Web 2.0, 3.0, social media, user-generated content, cloud computing, new search technology, and things of that sort. There's lots of creative stuff that is occurring all over the world, in the US, in Europe, in emerging markets. And in the long term, this technological progress is going to be a source of economic success. The third source of economic kind of success, in addition to globalization and technological progress, is this shift of economic power is occurring today from advanced economies to emerging market economies. So we're becoming a multipolar world where there are major sources of economic growth, locomotives and engines that are not just the United States or Europe and Japan. It's Asia, it's Latin America, it's China, India, Brazil, and many other ones. And if we had to really think about what's going on in the global economy to expand some of the points that Jim has made, there is a shift of economic, trading, financial, and eventually also political power from the US to China, from the G3, US, Europe, and Japan to the BRICS, from the West to the East, from North to South, from US and Europe towards Asia, Latin America, and other emerging market economies, from advanced economies to emerging markets. And the center of global economic governance has gone from the G7 that had become obsolete to the G20 that are becoming the new steering committee of the global economic power. And some people go as far as saying that even a country or a region like Africa that was underdeveloped might be the next brick. There is lots of things that are happening, even in Africa, that might lead actually even Africa to get out of its trap of underdevelopment. Now, I remember that a few years ago at Davos, Larry Summers made the point that the emergence of China and India in the global economy was the most important event in human history in the last 1,000 years after the Italian Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. And certainly, the integration of 2.3 billion Indians, let alone other billions of people in Asia and Latin America in the global economy, the fact that billions of people are joining the global labor force is a key element that is going to change radically the global economy. And here in the West, sometimes we're not aware of the importance of it. So it's really is historical. Now, this rise of emerging market economy explains also many of the paradoxes and conundrums that we see in the global economy. For example, the fall in the real wages of unskilled workers in advanced economies. If you add, 2 billion Indians, and they're all low-skilled, and that implies, from a trade point of view, of course, a fall in the relative return to unskilled labor and return higher to capital. We also have other problems, however. We have greater income inequality in advanced economies. We don't know how much of it is driven by trade, how much of it is driven by skill-intensive technological progress, how much of it is driven by winner-take-all effects, but that's a source of tension. We have these rising commodity prices, oil, energy, food, and other ones, coming from the higher growth of China, India, and other emerging markets. We have this phenomenon of a global savings glut, where this increase in savings in emerging markets keeps long-term interest rates low. We have these global current account imbalances, with the US being the consumer first and last resort, and China the producer of first and last resort. We have this paradox of capital not going from advanced economies to emerging markets, but going from emerging markets to advanced economies, with advanced economies having current account deficits and being net debtor rather than creditors. Now, all these things imply the following thing. The rise of this emerging market, I think, in the long term is going to be a positive force in the global economy. Economists think not in terms of zero-sum games, but they think that integration actually is a positive sum game. The fact that China and India are emerging is going to be, in the long run, good for all of us through lower cost of goods and services that's beneficial to everybody. But it's also true that globalization has to be managed to make sure that it's good for all. And there are lots of tension and dislocation that derive from this globalization. So what are the risks that come from this globalization? We have greater trade conflicts and risk of trade protectionism. We have increased income and wealth inequality, especially in advanced economies. We have these trade wars and these currency wars. Look what's happening with the currency mercantilism of countries like China. We have these hot money flows that are flowing in and out of the countries and sometimes lead to financial crisis. That's why many emerging markets are reacting with capital controls, both on inflows and outflows. There's been some degree of backlash against foreign direct investment, against sovereign wealth funds, the phenomenon of not just of trade, but also of financial protectionism. There has been an increased frequency and virulence of financial crises around the world. They used to occur once every 20 years, now they occur every other year. And not only they occur with more virulence, but the international contagion of them is more severe. Not just from large economies like the US to other countries, but even small economies can have global ripple effects. Look what's happened in the spring with Greece having global contagious effects. So even small economy can have, through financial channels, global transmission effects. There's been this rise of state capitalism with sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, and publicly owned multinational corporations in emerging markets becoming more powerful, with all the question about what they're going to do, whether they're driven by profit motives or political ones. There's been the failure of the Anglo-Saxon model of a pure laissez-faire model, but also a failure of the continental European social welfare model. So what's the right economic model? An Asian economic model? It's not clear there is one. So those are some of the questions that you have to think in mind about the medium-long term. It's not only the rise in absolute terms and the relative fall of the US and the West that is occurring, but in many ways I would argue there is an absolute fall also in the economic performance of advanced economies. Not just that emerging markets are emerging in relative terms, but there has been also an absolute decline. Take Japan, take Eurozone and the European Union, and take the United States. Japan is a country that has low potential growth, has a demographic decline that is severe, is a country that has never done structural reform, had 15 years of a near depression, has a blocked political system that is not doing any reform. They've changed something like 5 prime ministers in the last 4 years. It looks like Italy in the 60s and 70s. This year alone, they had 2 prime ministers, and if Ozawa this week is successful, it's going to be the 3rd prime minister in 12 months. They've not done the structural reform, and they are in secular long-term decline. It's becoming already the 3rd largest rather than the 2nd largest economy in the world. That's a serious problem. There's deflation, there's a strength of yen. Look at what happened during the spring in the Eurozone. They kicked the can down the road with $1 trillion bailout package, but sovereign spreads are back to the May level. There is low economic growth. There are deflation at risk, loss of competitiveness, risk of a breakup of the Eurozone down the line, risk of sovereign default in some of the countries. I was last week in a conference in Italy, and the Prime Minister of Belgium said that the Europeans are going to react to this financial crisis by becoming even more common policies and doing coordinated policies. The problem is he cannot keep together his own country. Belgium as a country is literally breaking up politically, might be divided soon in 2. So the guy cannot keep together his own country, let alone having united Europe. Those are the problems that are faced in the Eurozone. And let's think about the United States. United States, in the last 30 years, had periods of high economic growth only when there was a financial bubble, where the real estate bubble in the 80s ended up in the S&L crisis and a severe recession in 1991. Then where the tech bubble in the 90s ended up with a financial crisis in the 2001 recession. Then we created the subprime credit bubble of 06, 07, and then it ended up in the worst economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression. Can we grow in a way that's sustainable without going from one financial bubble and one bubble followed from crash and bust? Is not clear. Certainly this model of laissez-faire approach to financial market without any regulation supervision has failed in the United States. We have very large fiscal deficits that are growing, $1 trillion deficit for as far as I can see, large current account deficits. We have both in the US and advanced economies aging of population and unfunded liabilities coming from Social Security and high and rising healthcare costs. How are we going to deal with it? We have poor and crumbling infrastructures. I would say we even have a very low skills of the labor force. Now, at places like this one and places like Google, of course, the human capital is very high and skilled, but think about what's happening on the average American. There's been a recent study by the US Army that tried to figure out which kind of people they can take into the Army, and they decided to exclude people who have the following characteristics. People that are obese, who are drug users, who don't have a high school degree, and who have a criminal record. Why would the Army care about criminal record if you're a fighter? Because it turns out if you have a criminal record, you start stealing right and left. Turns out if you use these 4 criteria to exclude people, and you take young people, 2/3 of the young population in the United States does not qualify for the Army, okay? So that's the result of a strategic study of the Army. So they don't qualify for the Army, let alone for being employed in any low-skill or high-skill job. This is a serious problem. We don't think about it. We think about high-tech. We think about the high human capital in this room and around the high-tech company. But there is 2/3 of the population young in the United States who doesn't have the skill to be in the Army. That's a serious problem. We have a culture of instant consumption, instant gratification, of not enough savings. We have increased income and wealth inequality. Is it normal that 1% of the households in the United States control 25% of the income? Double from 20 years ago? It's something that is problematic. We have a gridlock and stalemate in US Congress, in politics. Somebody who has been around in Washington for the last 30 years, senior, told me, I've never seen so much, not disunity, but hatred between the 2 parties. The problem has to be resolved with bipartisanship. There is no bipartisanship. And after November, there's going to be more gridlock, lack of bipartisanship, and division of government. With this decline of the geopolitical power of the United States that the US doesn't seem to be able to accept, we're going to a multipolar world today. And we have now these nationalist, nativist, and isolationist policies in the United States on immigration towards Muslim and the role of religion in society. I would like to summarize making the following final points. The problems that are in the global economy are global, but the policies are still national. To resolve these global problems, we need global coordination, but that is not occurring. We need it on global climate change, conflicts on water and resources, overfishing of fisheries, global trade conflicts, energy and oil security, global current account imbalances, restoring global monetary and financial stability and avoiding crisis, achieving global security and peace. All these things are international problems that require international policy, but the policies are national. Now, there is a theory in geopolitics that says that in every century, you need an hegemon that is providing these global public goods. You know, in the 19th century was the UK, in the 20th century was the US. Today, people talk about the Asian or the China century. The trouble is that the US is in decline. It has fiscal burden. It has insular policies. And there is not a balance of great power. It's very hard to achieve a coordination of these policies at the global level because many of these emerging markets, whether it's China or India, are free riding and are not providing these global public goods. China is free riding on currency, on global climate change, on political issues. India on trade. Russia is a declining power, is not cooperating. The problem is that also formal power is in balance at the UN, at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the G7 level. And so far, we have not had a shift of effective global economic power or in the institution of global economic power. So the conclusion is the following one. Globalization, emergence of emerging market economies, trade, technological progress can lead to an outcome that is a better one in the long run if it resolves the problem in the short run. If we don't do it, actually we could end up like Japan with a situation of long-term economic stagnation. That doesn't have to happen, but the policies, especially in the advanced economies, have to start to go in a different direction. Thanks.